How carbon markets should work. Carbon is everywhere, in the atmosphere, the ground, the sea, and everything in between, including animals, plants, and humans. Measuring the changes in the carbon levels will allow us to better manage the carbon movements to reverse the effects of climate change. Global warming occurs because of extra atmospheric carbon from emissions, which increases the insulator effect that keeps the planet habitable. This leads to rising global temperatures that cause more extreme weather events and melts the polar ice caps. For thousands of years, nature managed the carbon balance by taking carbon from the atmosphere into plants as part of their photosynthesis process. Animals take in carbon by eating plants or each other. Manures, animal carcasses, leaves, branches, and even trees fall to the ground eventually and are consumed by the soil microbes. The bacteria and fungi microbes convert these carbon life forms to amino acids and proteins for plants to grow. Some carbon is stored in the ground and eventually becomes hydrocarbons in the form of coal, oil, and gas after millions of years. Hydrocarbon is carbon captured from the atmosphere and stored out of harm's way by nature. Today, we take this carbon from the ground as fossil fuels, and by burning it, emit it into the atmosphere and sea. This is the exact opposite of how it is supposed to happen. Soils are the re-entry point for atmospheric carbon back into the ground, making soils the carbon battleground in effect, one that must be won. Ultimately, the carbon market focuses on the replacement of the use of fossil fuels and the re-establishment of the flows of carbon back into the ground. Unfortunately, most carbon finance is focused on high-tech, carbon replacement, or efficiency-centric businesses called renewable energy. They cannot scale to replace fossil fuels completely because of the vast resources they all require and because they do not come in a form that can be used everywhere. Atmospheric carbon, on the other hand, is taken in by trees and crops and is on its way to the ground in enormous volumes all around us, naturally, every day. This is natural carbon capture on a planetary scale. Our farmers manage this every day. Yet carbon markets fail to invest in this optimum carbon capture technology at this time. Ground carbon, and the crops above, are where the climate change carbon investment should be focused and where the most immediate and cost-effective carbon changes can be made. Current carbon markets operate in two areas to make changes to our carbon balance. 1. The compliance market is regulated by governments to make heavy emitters of carbon pay for the damage to our planet and change how they do business. 2. The voluntary, now verified, market is focused on projects to take carbon back into the ground, such as forests, conservation, and soils. There is a growing crossover between the markets as the compliance markets seek projects to store carbon to allow their client base to continue emitting rather than making changes to their current business practices or their fuel source. The point that everyone continues to miss is that the failure in our energy system is the source of energy, fossil fuels, not how we make energy. Fossil fuels are sourced from deep ground stored carbon that is, literally, dug up and thrown back into the atmosphere from where it came from. This is the reverse of how the carbon should be flowing. It should be going from the atmosphere into the ground. Biological fertilizers take this carbon back into the ground and build the critical production base for agroenergy and food. Agroenergy crops are grown on the land and have very low emissions from their use as new crops absorb the carbon emitted from the burning of the previous crop as fuels. Biological fertilizers and agroenergy have an atmospheric carbon reduction outcome, thereby climate change will reduce as their use is increased simultaneously with the reduction in fossil fuel use they replace. Energy wealth will fund the transition of farming from modern industrial, back to modern conventional farming with biological fertilizers giving the platform for sustainable, carbon-negative fuels. This same platform of soils builds healthier food production and forests for less cost and less risk. Conventional farming fed the world for thousands of years before fossil fuels, modern farming, and chemicals. Renewable energy, wind, wave, solar, and nuclear, are part of the energy portfolio, but agroenergy crops have the largest, quickest, and least impactful solution to the energy and carbon issues. Agroenergy can, and does, produce better fuel alternatives than fossil fuels. They are equally energy-dense and compatible with current technology, thereby making them the best replacement for fossil fuels. Renewable energy of all forms has significant material, energy, technology, and maintenance costs. They need fossil fuel energy to make and operate them, and they take decades to become a sizable contribution to the economic supply landscape. Layering energy wealth over the agricultural sector is immediate, many times more scalable, and captures carbon naturally, achieving the climate changes that carbon credits were ultimately designed to realize. There is no need to develop a whole new technology or market or service industry, it all exists through farming in huge numbers. This is carbon farming. If the carbon markets focused on three primary areas, the planet would win the war on climate change. All three focus on restoring the natural carbon balance through natural carbon cycles and include renewable energy. This should include other considerations such as eating less meat, deforestation, and better crop and farm methodologies. However, this has been kept very simple for clarity and focus on positive outcomes in the shortest period for the least cost. 1. Replace fossil fuels with agro-energy and renewables. Every fossil fuel can be replaced with crop-grown fuels, cheaper, more sustainably, and without carbon emissions. There is more than enough land for food, forests, and fuel. 2. Replace chemicals in farming with biological soils built from organic waste streams and farm waste. Biological fertilizer takes excess carbon from the atmosphere back into the ground where it belongs, rebuilding the soil health and ability to produce commercial farm yields. 3. Accelerate the compliance market cleaning of emissions and maximize the best use of all energy sources to further reduce emissions. Separately from the carbon markets, conservation needs to become mainstream as conservation forests are critical for water, carbon, and biodiversity. Carbon is not the way to finance conservation as the carbon credit revenues are insufficient to fund the conservation. These natural forests should be financed as a result of the conservation outcome itself, as this is the value proposition from which finance is realized. This will be dealt with in a separate presentation. Forestry and agriculture have to be commercially successful beyond the influence of carbon, or they will fail. Carbon amounts to less than 10% of the potential revenues from agriculture and forestry. The simplest and most effective way for carbon to feature in forestry and agriculture is through the biological fertilizers being applied back into the fields in billions of tons per year. Applying atmospheric carbon into the ground by millions of farmers, each applying a few hundred tons of biological fertilizers, makes sense. They do this kind of work every day on their farms. This carbon capture rebuilds the production platform for sustainable energy, food, and forests, all of which have far-reaching carbon balance benefits themselves. The costs for producing and applying these huge volumes of carbon material back into the fields are met by improving crop cash flow by reducing crop input costs and improving income due to healthier produce. Better soils reduce crop risk, further enhancing commercial gains for all farmers. This builds and supports the whole economy through domestic energy and food production coupled with domestic consumer market development and value. Biological soil fertilizer application in the fields is compatible with carbon credit compliance market methodology, meaning these carbon credits will receive support from the broader markets. Placing tons of societal organic waste repurposed into productive, safe, commercial biological soils under new forestry or agro-energy crops epitomizes effective carbon outcomes. Carbon cannot finance the soils or agriculture on its own, carbon farming can, especially if aligned with the energy, food and forestry markets. Another efficiency professor media presentation.